I'm here again with Rietje on July 23rd, 2024, and we're going to discuss more of the restrictions of the mobilization and invasion of Holland.
The invasion, yeah, and life under the invasion. I could talk about life under the invasion or during the invasion for 6 weeks to come because it was very stressful and also funny because in the meantime we all grew up, and with 7 boys in a family that were all pretty precocious and bright. It was funny. It was noisy, funny, chaotic, at times really disciplined, especially during meals, but it was also very funny. And like in any big family, there are groups of people. You connect more with one or two brothers than you do with all of them. And that creates a very nice bond that I can now say, at 80 or at 92, that lasts, that special relationship with the very special ones out of your family. And with me, that was Walt, who later went to New Zealand, and Tim, who stayed in Holland, became a very successful lawyer. And Tim was very, very sensitive and let his feelings flow, with Tim, when he was sad or mad or happy. Or Eric, the brother that followed him, and they were very close. Tim and Eric were 2 eggs in a basket, I always thought. And Eric was very, very quiet. Whatever he said was worth saying, and he had a tremendous, quiet, and hilarious sense of humor. And Tim was like an explosion all the time. Great sense of humor, great storyteller. And so the combination of the two was just fantastic. And I don't know if I told you the story of Tim and Eric. During one night, they shared a bedroom, and Eric's bed was almost under a window, and Tim's bed was across the room. And one night the window was open, and one night it really started to rain. And Tim woke up and he thought, like Tim, quickly, oh, close the window, close the window. So he had to kind of lean over Eric's bed and close the window. And Eric heard that and he said, what are you doing? Tim said, I'm closing the window because it rains and, the rain is coming right on your bed. And then Tim looked at Eric and he said, Eric, didn't you hear the rain? Why didn't you close the window? And Eric shrugged his shoulder and he said, I didn't feel like it. And that was the relationship, and that really describes their characters. And I always thought that was a real fantastic thing.
Yeah.
So, well, in the meantime, the war went on, and there were more and more restrictions. We had a tram that connected us with several cities around us, and the tram service became a little bit less because, that cost the Germans money, and why give it to the population if they could save. So that was a beginning, and my dad's car was gone. So we all had bikes. I did not, because I was too little, or, well, I wasn't too long, but at that time you couldn't even get a bike. But then came the time when you could not get things to repair the bike tires. You couldn't get tires anymore. So people started to put a wooden strip in the, and I don't know what you call, it's like a rail, when you take a tire off
The rim?
the rim, that's, yeah. And so they've put wood, and I'm sure they had to steam the wood in order to bend it. But that's what people would ride on, and you know, it was brain damaging because the streets then were paved still. It was not smooth. So it was, but you couldn't make much much time on a bike like that, and it was hard. So that was one thing. So no cars, no gas at all, unless you were a doctor or you were in some kind of organization where you had to be present, at a distance all of a sudden. Um, so that was one thing, and then I think that I covered that we had to give all our copper, pewter, silver, everything to the Germans for the war effort. And of course, when you did that, you got a big piece of paper with all kinds of stamps. The German loved stamps, bang, bang, bang. And so what we did was we gave something insignificant so we could get a proof that we had delivered something to them, and the rest we buried in the backyard, like many people did, and so it was gone. The radio, the same. You took a little old radio, you gave that, and you hid your real radio, which we did. And I think I mentioned that in my previous session. In any case, life became it became difficult, and especially when the Germans started forcing the Dutch man to go to Germany to start working in factories for the war effort. And you could do that on a voluntary basis. And then I can't say that your life in Germany was good, but you would get sufficient food to work, and you could even get a little bit of a reprieve, and you could go back to Holland by train and spend some time with your family, and then back to the war effort. The people who did that were not regarded well by the Dutch general population, because it was still a thing to help the Germans, and as a good Dutch person, you did not help them. Or you did not want to help them. But the Germans were, of course, looking for strong people, and they set out a decree that all the males between 16 and I think it was 64 had to work for the Germans. So there came a time when you were in that age that you would not go out on the street. For instance, if your mother said, go across and get some milk or do some shopping, you wouldn't do that because the Germans might pick you up. and sent you away. Um, and those camps, of course, when they picked you up, were concentration camps and not what the Germans so nicely said labor camps. Um, and so life became really became fearful, and that also manifested itself among all of us. There was a lot of tension in that time. The Dutch resistance came into being, and we had lots of people come to our house and people who had to hide for a few days. It was really, especially when you're young, like I was, you want to ask questions, and nothing was ever explained to me because the less I knew, the better it was. And the same for Walt and Hans, who were a little bit older than I was, but sometimes children are forced to speak, and it was better that we did not know. But we knew that things were going on because we saw all these people come and have meetings with my dad. And my dad was via England uh, told that he had to be the head of the little town where we lived. If anything happened, he was head of the resistance. And so he had many people who came to the house, or he went to them. But there was always this undercurrent of tension, of fear, of whispering. Nothing was normal anymore. And then the nights, as I described, with airplanes going over, and later when the Allies had joined, when America had joined, had declared war, the Americans came from England, of course, over Holland to Germany, and it was every night. And it was tense. And I remember going to school, and my school was a convent school, and beautiful, and the Germans licked their lips, to get that, and they did. And so the whole school and all the nuns had to move among people in my hometown. And school was held here and there. And then sometimes we were in a building that belonged to a church, a Catholic church, and it had, big rooms. And I remember being there for about a year. And around 11 o'clock, we were allowed to play outside for 15 minutes. And you would, like, you walk, you play, you run, but always planes overhead and the contrails. And I must have been a fearful child, and one of my sisters called me a coward because I let them know that I was afraid, and I was fearful. And I would not have wished that on my children. So you try to play, but in the meantime, over your head, there's you are well aware there's a war going on. And I remember that, and then going to bed, and again, the sound of planes, and sometimes those planes crashed, and some of the crew would survive. The resistance would pick them up and put them with people, injured. They were healed, and then they tried to get these men back to America via Belgium and France into Spain. But Belgium and France were, of course, occupied. So you can imagine that took a long time and was enormously tense and awful. Um, and I remember tales of people who went with a crew member on a train, for instance, where we lived to the south of Holland, and of course the crew member couldn't speak a word of Dutch or German, and so it was really they always said he's what is it, a mute or deaf, um, and he can't talk. Um, but they of course were very healthy looking normally, and um, and always had good teeth, which is a difference between Europeans and Americans. Um, and especially now when I go to England, still teeth are not as beautiful as people are here, because I think the dental care has been really so good here for so long. Um, and I think that Americans just are very tooth conscious and brush and keep them nice into old age. And that's the difference. But then, during the war, it was even more, you were aware of that more even. Um, in any case, that was part of my growing up, and it was tense and it was not good. I was a good student in school, nothing exceptional, but all right. And my work in school became less good, and I think that was because of tension, of lack of sleep, because well, our airplanes overhead, you don't sleep very well. So plus the food supply became less and less. So what you ate was not quite as good, like bread was not good, and you didn't have a choice of what kind of bread you could buy. You had what the baker had, and you were glad that he had some bread. But that became less and less and less, and I think that that was also a reason that children didn't do well in school because of stress and bad bad nutrition. So, um, in the meantime, uh, my brother-in-law, Teun, did I mention that he was picked up and
I believe you did.
sent to a prisoner of war camp? I think,
Yeah.
yeah, I think we have that. But I was so concerned about my sister Will, who was by then married to him, married by proxy, but married to him. And of course, the big question is, how long does the war last? Will he ever come back? How is he? Is he cold? Is he hungry? This lives with you. And I was so bonded with her, and I loved her so much that reflected, her sadness reflected on me too. And I did everything to make her happy. I would always, if there were flowers, if we had a good summer, I would always pick flowers and put them in her bedroom with a little card that it was for me, because otherwise she wouldn't know. And I'm sure that I must have been sometimes a real bother to her, because I was so not in love with her, but she was like my mother figure, like my mom was. And so I didn't want her to be sad. And I would walk to school, and then I would walk home. And in my young head, I thought, oh, Turn has escaped. And when I get in the house, in the hallway we had a big coat rack. I'll see Teun's coat there, and he's back. So I run home, because this was all true in my imagination. I would come in the hallway, and of course, no coat. Bang. All that happiness and expectation was all of a sudden gone. And I couldn't tell anyone because they would say, "Oh, don't talk nonsense. He'll come back, he'll be all right." And so it was a kind of a hard time for a young child, I think, because you did not get the attention that I would have had under normal times. Nobody checked, if I was doing well in school or not, because that wasn't of the essence then. And so in the meantime, life went on, and my brothers, who were at the age to be picked up by the Germans, could not leave the house during the day. At night, they would sleep in a friend's house, and I don't know how it worked, and the friends would send someone to us. It was a mess, but nobody slept in their own house because the Germans had lists. They knew who lived where and how many people there were in the house. So they usually came at night, um, and stormed in your house and checked and picked up whoever they could use. And that idea of not being safe in your own house, the intimidation, the fear, the constant fear. Then as the war went on, you were always hungry because what you ate was not very nutritious. Milk was watered down.
Do you remember how many calories a day you
Oh, but that was in the last year. Yeah, that was not before. That was in that started in September of 44. Um, but things got progressively worse and worse, and more restrictions. More you would go from your house to school and you had to go through a checkpoint. The Germans were standing there, guns ready. You always had to have a proof. It was called an Ausweis, a piece of paper with your picture and your name, that you were who you were, and you had to check that. And of course, sometimes those soldiers were tired of that too, and they would go like this and go. But there were soldiers who were really mean and threatening, and so nothing. Everywhere you went, it was fearful. And then the tram stopped running, and the trains stopped running for regular people. And then the people who, were in the train union only had to transport political prisoners to concentration camps. And so one day in September, they decided to strike and to stop doing that. Which was, if you can imagine how many workers there were in the train union. And once they put on a strike, they had to find places to hide. So they had to find families where they could stay until the end of the war. And nobody knew when the war would end. And every family didn't have enough to eat, didn't you could not wash like normal, so you didn't have beds to spare. It was awful. But these people did go on strike. They did go in hiding, and the Germans were, of course, most uh, gruesomely unhappy, and they said, "Okay, you strike, we cut off that part of Holland, and we starve you to death. There's nothing coming in, and what's there you can use, and then it's over." And that's when we started. Uh, we had 3 hours of electricity during the day, no electricity at night. And normally you would say, so you light candles, but you couldn't get candles. Couldn't get candles anywhere, except probably on the black market. And then food became non-existent. And luckily, my dad had a client who was in the bulb business, and they grow once the bulbs have grown and are removed from the soil. They plant a crop, and he planted a crop of lima beans. And he gave my dad a big basket of lima beans in September. And I think if we had not had those lima beans, because my mom would just get a handful of lima beans and put it in a pan with onions, sugar beets, corn that was normally fed to the pigs, um, maybe some carrots if you could get them, cabbage, but it was just water with vegetables. And we had a stove that was not bigger than uh, an American coffee can, and it had a little door in it. And you fed little pieces of wood like that, and it was strong enough to hold a big pan of water with vegetables. That was always on the stove. That was our source of heat in in the living room for that winter. That winter in the winter was okay until December. It was cold and rainy, like it is always in Holland, and then we had the opposite of what we were here now. We have a heat wave, but there it was a cold wave. The temperature went down to, I remember 29 degrees, and I don't know right now out of my head to translate that in an American fashion, but it was cold and there was no fuel. People started to burn their, like the frames in the bed, chairs, doors. It was awful, and of course there was not a tree left because people, anything that could burn was just taken, and it was awful. There was no light at night because no electricity, no candles. So you sat in the dark, and my brothers fixed a bike. Someone had to sit on the bike and pedal, and then there was a headlamp. That was all the light we had. And in the meantime, airplanes going over, the fear that the Germans could get in your house and, take everything what they wanted, plus, the people they needed. So you were not safe. You were not fed. You were cold. One thing that was terrible was going to bed because there was no heat in the house at all. The walls had ice on it. The beds were damp because the sheets, in a ice cold room where ice is on the wall, the sheets become damp and moldy. And so when you went to bed, it took really so long to get warm. And by the time you were warm, it was morning and you had to get out of bed. And I know that people who were so deteriorated and hungry and miserable, they stayed in bed and they just died because there was nothing. They had twice a week, they had a central kitchen. I would cook something like pea soup. They would put pea meal in water and get that hot, take it to certain places, and you could get one ladle. You had to bring a pan or whatever you could carry soup in, and you would get a label per person in your family. And there was also something, a mash, potatoes with cabbage usually, smashed together, and you got a big spoon of that per person. But that was twice a week. And the bread we got was a piece of bread, no bigger than that, 400 grams a week. And you couldn't slice it because it was not baked well, because there was no fuel. There was, what is the stuff that when you saw wood that falls to
the sawdust?
what?
The sawdust?
Sawdust. There
Yeah.
was sawdust in the bread to give it bulk. And so it was horrible stuff. And so I don't know, I can't remember personally that I was hungry, but what I really remember was the cold and the dark. That was just awful. You couldn't escape it. You couldn't do anything about it. And because I had such a bond with my sister Bill, and she was always cold, even normally, she was always cold. So I would start to sleep in her bed, and when she would come to bed, I would go to my own bed, one story up, if you can imagine that. So it took me, another hour, because by that time in her bed I was nice and warm. And then I had to go to that damp cold bed. And so, yeah, but I loved doing that for her because I felt that would make her feel better, not so sad. So it was awful. And in the meantime, in all the dark and all the misery, airplanes over the resistance became more prominent, and they killed Germans. And then, of course, the Germans took their wrath out on the population, usually. And Jan, my oldest brother, was in the resistance with a young group. And my dad was in a group of older men. And I remember the heated discussions between the two, because Jan was all for go kill them, and he always said, doesn't matter. His favorite thing was, doesn't matter, we're all going kaput, which is the German word for, done. And so my father would say, hey, caution, and that's not the way to do it, like an older man would say that. But it was the tension between the two that was awful, really, really awful. I don't know. As a child, you just kind of observe and you listen. At that time, nothing was explained because the less we knew, the better it was. And so we muddled on through that winter uh, with our little coffee can stove and no clothes. And my mom managed for my birthday on the 25th of January to give me a new dress. And what was so interesting was that Russia had joined the Allies and was fighting the Germans. And in any war reflects on fashion. I remember that there was a big, if it wasn't a war, there was something going on in India, and my mother made me a coat that was before the war with a high collar, like people have in India, with a little head that was just what the Indian men usually wore. That was then very fashionable. So that reflected, a war, and the fashion world picked that up. And then the fashion world in Europe picked up Russian fashion. A little stand-up collar with braid down here and braid here and braid on the bottom. And that dress was hanging on my closet door on my birthday morning, and the material was from a dress from my mom that she had taken apart and made a dress for me. And I've never forgotten that. That was something so miraculous, a new dress, because all I had were cotton things, because there was nothing. You couldn't buy anything. And I didn't have shoes. I had, it was a wooden sole with cloth straps that you just kind of knotted, and that's what you walked on. Very noisy and cold in the winter, but that was it. And my mother knitted whatever she could, whatever wool she had, but you also couldn't get wool to darn socks anymore, which you can say, oh, okay, so you have holes in your socks. But when it's very cold and the soles of your shoes are not very good, then the holes in your stockings or socks are a bother, and it's cold. And during that winter, my sister Will and my brother Augie went, like so many people, they hopped on a bike, and luckily they had bikes that still had tires. And my sister didn't have shoes, but she had a pair of ice skates, white leather shoes. So she unscrewed her skates and wore her white leather shoes. And so they biked, I don't know, they went to the north of Holland because there were a lot of farms there. And they took whatever they could barter with. Money was not worth anything. But if you had like sheets or anything, a piece of silver or jewelry, you could barter. And they did that twice. And I don't know how they survived because it was so cold. So cold. Plus the fact that if you had anything on your bike, you were often robbed by people. And so it was dangerous to do that. And it was just the most courageous thing that they could do. And they came back with just, little bag of beans and and some food, but at least it was something for their effort. But they were gone for about 2 weeks, and there was no communication, there's no phone, nothing. And so you don't know where they are. Will they come back? Are they picked up? Are they robbed? So things were just really most miserable. I can't even begin to explain. And then December came, and we, of course, at that time, everybody was expecting an invasion of some kind from England to come to the coast, either Holland, Belgium, or France. And so, but nothing was forthcoming. And then Hitler had his secret weapon, which were rockets that were shot off and usually sent direction England. And they were shot off about 8 kilometers from our house. And sometimes they would go up and plummet down right away. So we usually waited until about 5 or 6 seconds. And if we didn't hear them, then we would go in the doorway or under the dining room table, because the darn thing would come down and explode. So the Allies tried to bomb the places where the Germans shot them off, and that was along the coast. And at first they were along the coast where you could see, but they soon learned that that was not the way to do it, and they took them into The Hague, our nearest town, and they put them in just neighborhoods, and they moved them every night from street to street. So when you're in an airplane, you can't find them, or it's really difficult to find them. So they kept shooting them off, and that was a part of the war where we thought, oh, are we going to win this war, or are we going to lose it? And the whole thing was so enormously depressing and awful. And then Christmas came, and there was nothing, nothing to make, not even a candle to burn. And we had friends across the street who had a shop. It was I tried to explain that before. They had milk, eggs, all kinds of dairy products, some groceries, and all kinds of different meats. And so they had stashed away some food. They were friendly with my parents, and they said, okay, for Christmas, whatever you have, you cook, we bring whatever we have, we cook, and we eat together. And that was a semblance of a meal. And I remember Jan, my brother, who was a medical student, so good in science, but he also had an artistic bent, and he made menus. I still have one menu that he painted a few candles and holly leaves, and on the back he wrote what was on the menu. And so that was one thing that I remember that was, I can't say happy, but that was a little bit different. And but once evening falls and the airplane's over, miserable cold, I thought this would never end. And I must have been a super depressed little girl by then.
Is that what
But nobody paid attention because everybody was in that boat. So I was just
1940,
pardon.
what year would that have
That
been?
was 44.
44,
So that was 44, and then Christmas and New Year, that became 1945. And you always think somehow after Christmas and New Year that things are a little bit different. And you know, we in previous years we always thought, okay, this is going to be a year when the war is over. That New Year, we were all in a state of depression and said, this is just it was misery everywhere. And so we went through the month of January, and that was the day on the 25th I had my birthday, and my mom made me a dress, which was, you know, a bit of light and a surprise and wonderful, something almost normal, but just for one day, and then you sink again. So February came, and at the last day, no, on the 24th of February, we our house was surrounded by Germans plus Dutch military people who had volunteered to get in with the Germans. So they were traitors, and I will go into that the next time because that is a very black and awful time, and I just can't do it now.
You want me to end it?
Is that okay?
Mhm.
Yeah.